My name is Serafina Sterling. For the first 2 decades of my life, that name was tethered to the imposing granite edifice of my family's legacy in Beacons Harbor, Massachusetts. The Sterlings were not merely residents, they were architects of the city's legal and social landscape. My father, the Honorable Alastair Sterling, was a federal judge whose name was whispered with a reverence usually reserved for historical monuments. My mother, Eleanor, orchestrated the city's high society with the quiet precision of a master conductor, her life a testament to flawless appearances. And my sister, Victoria, older by 5 years, was the heir apparent, a brilliant, sharp-edged corporate lawyer already making her name at a prestigious Boston firm. She was the polished mirror in which our family's ambitions were perfectly reflected. And then there was me. I was the whisper of color in their monochrome world, the quiet corner of the garden that grew wildflowers instead of manicured roses. While Victoria memorized case law, I filled sketchbooks with the shifting light on the harbor. While she networked at galas, I sat in dusty corners of the library with poets who had been dead for centuries. I loved my family, but I felt like a borrowed book in their pristine library, one whose cover didn't quite match the rest of the collection. I was loved, I suppose, in the way one loves a beautiful but impractical heirloom, acknowledged, but not truly understood or utilized. This quiet dissonance was the wallpaper of my childhood, a pattern so familiar I'd barely noticed it until the day it was ripped away. When I was 19, my sister told me I was a liability to the family. She didn't shout it. Victoria never needed to raise her voice. She said it in the hushed, confidential tone she used for delivering devastating legal arguments, a whisper that could sever a reputation as cleanly as a scalpel. It landed not like a blade, but like a shard of ice in my heart, freezing everything in its path. A week later, my father, a man who built his life on the bedrock of precedent and order, changed the locks on the doors of our stately home on Ocean Drive. My mother, who taught me that grace was the highest virtue, left a single duffel bag of my clothes on the cold flagstone porch. There was no goodbye, no final argument, no explanation. There was only a profound, echoing silence. They had their reasons, of course, etched in the rigid lines of their worldview. They said I was impulsive, emotionally volatile, a poor steward of the Sterling name. But the truth, the one that lived in the quiet spaces between their accusations, was that I simply couldn't remain silent about the things they were willing to overlook for the sake of their pristine image. I had a voice, and I had used it. That, in their world, was the unforgivable sin. For the next 15 years, I vanished. Serafina Sterling ceased to exist. I cut my long hair into a short, practical crop, changed my name, and moved across the country, erasing every trace of the girl who once sketched sailboats in Beacons Harbor. I didn't do it out of shame for who I was, but from the bone-deep certainty that they would never allow me to grow if I remained in their shadow. They had pruned me from the family tree, and I knew I could only truly blossom if I planted my roots in new, untended soil. And I did. I built a new life, a new identity, a new purpose, piece by painstaking piece. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, I walked into a federal courtroom in Boston where my sister, Victoria, was on trial. I didn't go for revenge or vindication. I went to bear witness, to see the final chapter of a story I had been written out of. I sat in the back, a ghost in a simple wool coat. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The judge, a woman I didn't recognize, paused the proceedings. She squinted toward the shadowed gallery, her brow furrowed in thought. "Forgive me," she said, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. "Wait, is that Serafina Sterling?" The author. Every head in the room, a sea of dark suits and anxious faces, swiveled in my direction. My sister's composure, the famous Sterling stoicism she wore like armor, finally shattered. Her mouth fell open in a perfect, silent O. And in that single, suspended moment, all the years I had spent buried under the weight of their silence cracked open. It wasn't a moment of triumph, not in the way one might expect. It was quieter, more profound. They had once called me a failure, a disgrace. But in that courtroom, the only thing louder than their stunned silence was the soft, steady sound of the world finally seeing me for who I had become, not for who they had cast away. This is the story of how I found my way back, not to them, but to myself. It's a story that is deeply close to my heart, and before I share it all, I would love it if you could say hello in the comments, or perhaps tell me where you're reading from. There is a quiet strength in knowing how far a story can travel, a reminder that we are never truly alone in our journeys. And if my words resonate with you, even in a small way, please consider subscribing. It would be an honor to share the next chapter with you. Thank you. Now, let me tell you everything. The air in our Beacons Harbor home was always thick with unspoken expectations, but on that particular Sunday in late May, it was practically suffocating. The dining room was the heart of our family's formal life, a space of mahogany and polished silver, where the soft glow of the crystal chandelier reflected in the gleaming surface of the table my great-grandfather had commissioned. Sunday dinners were a sacred tradition, a ritual my father upheld with the same unwavering discipline he applied to his courtroom. At the head of the table sat Judge Alastair Sterling himself, a patriarch carved from New England granite. He raised a wine glass, the crystal catching the light. To Victoria, he announced, his voice imbued with a rare, undisguised pride. On the muted television in the corner, a news segment was playing. Victoria's face, sharp and intelligent, filled the screen. She was being interviewed about a massive corporate merger she had just successfully orchestrated. The cheer-in read, Victoria Sterling, legal powerhouse. A true Sterling, my father concluded, and the finality in his tone was its own kind of verdict. I sat at the far end of the table, an island in the sea of their mutual admiration. My fork felt heavy in my hand as I pushed a piece of asparagus around my plate. My own graduation had been the week before. I had walked across the stage, my heart a fluttering bird in my chest, to receive a diploma in fine arts with a minor in philosophy. Not law, not economics, not medicine. I hadn't even told them the date. I knew, with a dull ache of certainty, that they wouldn't have come. In their world, my degree was a beautiful, useless thing, like a poem written in a forgotten language. I had always been the quiet anomaly in the Sterling equation. My world was one of charcoal smudges on my fingertips, not ink from a fountain pen signing legal briefs. My heroes were Mary Oliver and Simone de Beauvoir, whose well-worn paperbacks were tucked into my canvas tote bag. I found truth in the dappled light of a public park, in the quiet solitude of painting the sunrise over the harbor. During family meals, I often felt like a ghost at the feast, a faint, translucent echo of a person who used to belong. At 22, I was bright and full of a burgeoning wisdom they couldn't measure, and therefore couldn't value. The storm that broke my world began not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, insistent ping of my phone. A text from a concerned friend. Then another. A frantic voicemail from my roommate, her voice tight with panic. By the time I forced my trembling fingers to open my laptop, the flood had already arrived. A private, intimate video, filmed by my ex-boyfriend on a weekend trip months ago, was no longer private. My face, my body, my vulnerability, stolen, uploaded, and cast into the cruel, anonymous sea of the internet. The culprit was Leo, a man whose bruised ego after our breakup had festered into a quiet, calculated act of revenge. I hadn't known he'd kept it. I hadn't even considered it a possibility. There was no time for tears, no space to process the violation. My world imploded before I could even draw a breath. I learned later that Victoria had been the first to find it. She hadn't called me. She hadn't offered a word of comfort or sisterly protection. She had forwarded the link directly to my father with a single, chillingly pragmatic line, "You need to handle this before it damages the family name." Not to shield me, but to shield the name. That evening's Sunday dinner was canceled. My father didn't storm into my room. His anger was a cold, controlled force, far more terrifying than any outburst. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disappointment. "Is this what we raised you for, Serafina?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "For the world to see you like this?" He didn't have to finish the sentence. The unspoken word hung in the air between us, heavy and ugly. "I didn't do this," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I'm the victim here." "You are the source of the violation," he corrected me, his judicial tone slicing through my defense. "You violated the dignity of the Sterling name." He walked over to my desk and picked up my newly framed diploma, the one I had been so proud of. He tossed it onto my bed as if it were a piece of trash. "You want to live a life with no regard for propriety? Then you will do it without our name, without our roof, and without our money." My mother stood behind him, a sentinel of silent sorrow. Her hands were clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over my shoulder, as if I were already fading from view. I turned my eyes to Victoria, a desperate, final plea for something, a flicker of empathy, a shred of solidarity. But she just stood there, her arms crossed, her expression as cold and impenetrable as a winter sea. Not a single blink betrayed any emotion. I packed my duffel bag in a haze of disbelief. A few changes of clothes, my worn copy of Leaves of Grass, my leather-bound journals, and my box of charcoal pencils. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, bar-like shadows across the room, a prison of my own making. When I walked into the grand foyer, my father was waiting. He placed 5 $100 bills on the antique console table. $500 to erase 22 years. "Don't call," he said, the words of final judgment. "Don't write." As I stepped out onto the porch, the door clicking shut behind me, I saw my mother's silhouette peeking from behind the heavy velvet curtains of the living room window. She didn't wave. She didn't open the door. She just watched as her daughter walked away into the cooling dusk, disappearing from her life as quietly as the setting sun. The first few nights, I slept on the couch of a college friend whose sympathy, I soon realized, had an expiration date. By the end of the week, I was on a bus heading west, with no destination in mind other than away. Portland, Oregon, maybe. I'd heard it was a place where people went to start over, a city shrouded in mist and kindness. On the second night of that long, lonely journey, the bus pulled into a rest stop somewhere in the vast, empty plains of Nebraska. Under the humming fluorescent lights of the deserted station, I did something small and final. I took out the small, leather-bound book of poetry my mother used to read to me as a child, its pages filled with her delicate handwriting in the margins. It was the last, most precious piece of my old life. One by one, I tore out each page, the brittle paper whispering its protest. I walked to a rusty trash can at the edge of the parking lot and dropped the shredded pieces of my past inside. There was no fire, no dramatic flame. Just a quiet letting go. As the bus rumbled back onto the highway, I caught my reflection in the dark window. A pale, tired girl with haunted eyes, her entire world contained in a duffel bag at her feet. And I made a quiet vow to that reflection, a promise whispered into the darkness. "I have nothing left to lose," I said to the glass. "So I'll build a life from what's left of me." Portland in the fall was a watercolor painting of gray skies and damp, moss-covered trees. The chill in the air was a gentle, persistent thing, a stark contrast to the biting cold of a New England winter. It seeped into my worn jacket, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt cleansing. I found a room for rent in a sprawling old house in the Hawthorne district, a place with peeling paint, a perpetually dripping faucet in the shared bathroom, and walls so thin I could hear my neighbor's cat purring at night. My room was small, just big enough for a second-hand mattress on the floor, a wobbly card table for a desk, and a small, silvered mirror that showed a fractured version of my face. Rent was $200 a month. The room was mine. That was all that mattered. My life became a rhythm of constant motion, Mornings were spent at the Sun-Up Cafe, a bustling neighborhood diner where I slung hash browns and coffee, memorizing the orders of regulars whose names I'd forget the moment my shift ended. I learned to smile when I didn't feel like it, to make small talk about the relentless Portland rain. Afternoons, I worked as a cleaner at the Oakwood Community Health Center, a small clinic serving low-income families. I mopped floors, wiped down exam tables, and emptied trash cans filled with the quiet debris of other people's pain and hope. Evenings, I found a third job, inputting shipping data for a small logistics company called Cascade Freight. It was mindless work, done on a clunky, second-hand computer in the quiet of my little room, my fingers flying across the keyboard until the numbers blurred together. In the small, quiet hours of the night, when the city was asleep and the weight of my solitude pressed in on me, I would write. Not stories or essays, but fragments, observations, and feelings scribbled in a series of cheap spiral notebooks. It was a way of charting my own internal weather, of giving voice to the grief and anger and burgeoning hope without having to speak it aloud. I sketched too. I couldn't afford paints or canvas, so I bought a pack of charcoal sticks and a large newsprint pad. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I drew a single, gnarled tree, its roots exposed and twisted, but its branches reaching defiantly toward a sky that wasn't visible in the frame. I taped it to the wall opposite my mattress. It was the first piece of art I had made that was truly, entirely for myself. A few months into this new life, I stood in front of my cracked bathroom mirror and, on a sudden impulse, took a pair of scissors to my long, dark hair. I watched as the locks I had spent years tending to fell into the sink like shed skins. It wasn't a moment of crisis, it was a declaration. A quiet, deliberate shearing of the past. The woman who looked back at me, with her short, boyish hair and tired but determined eyes, was not Serafina Sterling. The next day, when I applied for a library card, I wrote down a new name, Sarah Stone. Sarah, a shortened, simpler version of my old name. Stone, for the strength and foundation I hoped to build. It felt right. It felt like mine. The turning point came one cold, rainy night at the clinic. I was doing my final rounds, the building quiet except for the hum of the old furnace. From down the hallway, I heard a man's voice, sharp and impatient, and a woman's voice, soft and pleading, in Spanish. I followed the sounds to a small waiting area where a young, uniformed security guard was standing over a woman who was clutching a small child. "Just sign the form," the guard said, tapping a clipboard. "It's standard procedure. A liability waiver." The woman, who looked no older than I was, shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No entiendo," she whispered, pulling her daughter closer. "I need a doctor." "You'll see a doctor after you sign," the guard insisted, his frustration mounting. Something inside me, a long-dormant protective instinct, flared to life. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I stepped forward. "She doesn't have to sign that," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The guard turned to me, annoyed. "Who are you? This is none of your business." "I work here," I said, a half-truth. "And that form is for non-emergency intake. She's here with a sick child. She needs to be triaged, not processed." It was a complete fabrication, a string of bureaucratic-sounding words I pulled from thin air. But I delivered it with the unshakable confidence I had seen my father use 1,000 times. The guard hesitated, thrown off balance by my conviction. He grumbled something under his breath, gave the woman one last frustrated look, and walked away. The woman looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears, and whispered, "Gracias." I expected to be fired the next day. Instead, I was called into the office of the clinic's director, a kind-faced man in his 60s named Mr. Samuelson. He gestured for me to sit down, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "The night security guard told me what happened," he said. "He said our janitor quoted clinic policy back to him." I felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I overstepped." "Overstepped?" Mr. Chen chuckled. Sarah, you advocated. You saw someone in need, and you used your voice to help them. Most people in your position would have kept their head down. Most people have more to lose, I replied, the words coming out before I could stop them. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. I run a small nonprofit that operates out of this building, he said. The Bridge Creek Collective. We help newly arrived refugee families get settled in Portland. We could use someone with your initiative. Not as a cleaner. I started at the bottom, of course. I made coffee, translated documents, and ran errands all over the city. But I also watched, and I listened, and I learned. I saw how a small act of kindness could change the course of a family's life. I began to understand the intricate, often unjust systems that these families had to navigate. I started drafting grant proposals in my spare time, using the research skills I'd honed in college. I wrote outreach materials, organized community workshops, and eventually began to manage our small budget. I took free online courses in nonprofit management and immigration policy, absorbing information like a dry sponge. I never spoke of home. The word felt foreign and painful on my tongue. But one day, after helping a family from Somalia find a furnished apartment and enroll their children in school, a young intern at the collective asked me, "Why are you so passionate about this work, Sarah?" I paused, looking around the cluttered, vibrant office, a place filled with donated furniture, children's drawings, and the constant hum of a half-dozen languages. I don't have a family to go back to, I said, the admission quiet but not painful. So I decided to help tend a garden where new ones could grow. And in that small, sunlit office in Portland, surrounded by the quiet courage of people who had lost everything and were brave enough to start again, I finally began to feel my own roots take hold. I was learning, finally, how to breathe again. 3 years after that fateful night at the clinic, I stood before the Portland City Council. The chamber was paneled in dark, glossy wood that reminded me, uncomfortably, of my father's study, but my voice didn't waver. It was calm and clear, carrying to the back of the room like a well-aimed stone. In the world of refugee and immigrant advocacy in Portland, Sarah Stone had become a quiet but unshakable presence. My reputation wasn't built on flash or charisma, but on the solid foundation of relentless, principled work. People listened when I spoke. I was no longer the girl who mopped floors. I had been appointed to a newly formed commission on refugee integration, a volunteer position that held no salary but offered a different kind of currency, a seat at the table where policies were shaped. The meeting that day was fraught with tension. A city commissioner, a man with a perpetually stern expression and a neatly knotted tie, was proposing a measure that would require local shelters to share information with federal immigration authorities. I waited for him to finish his polished, fear-mongering speech. Then I leaned into the microphone. When our laws cease to serve the core human principle of compassion, I said, my voice even, they become mere instruments of control. Justice that is not rooted in empathy is not justice at all. It is merely procedure. A hush fell over the room, broken by a ripple of quiet applause from the public gallery. The commissioner offered no rebuttal. After the meeting, a young reporter from the Portland Mercury approached me in the hallway. He was eager with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. That was a powerful statement, he said. We'd love to do a feature on you. You know, the new face of advocacy in the city, a rising leader. A familiar, cold knot tightened in my stomach. Thank you, but I'd prefer not, I said. He looked surprised. Why not? You have an important message. The message is important, I agreed. The face is not. If you write about the work of the collective, that would be wonderful. But please, don't use my full name. Just S. Stone. He looked puzzled, but finally nodded. Okay. No headshot, I take it. I offered him a small, polite smile that didn't reach my eyes. I've learned that being seen isn't always a kindness. That night, back in my small but comfortable studio apartment, a significant upgrade from my first room, This one with reliable heat and a view of a maple tree. I performed my nightly ritual. I didn't keep photographs of my family. The pain of that was still too sharp. Instead, on my windowsill sat a single, perfect scallop shell I had found on the beach in Beacon's Harbor as a child, long before the storm. It was smooth and white, a symbol of a time when my world was simple and whole. I would hold it in my palm, its familiar ridges a comfort against my skin, and whisper a quiet mantra to the darkness, "Let the work be the story, not the storyteller." There were nights I allowed myself to wonder. Did my mother still have pictures of me on her mantelpiece, or had they all been quietly stored away in the attic? Did my father ever mention his younger daughter to his colleagues? I never Googled them. I never looked for them on social media. The distance was a carefully constructed wall, and I knew it was necessary for my own healing. I was learning that recovery wasn't a straight line forward. Sometimes it was about building a sanctuary, a walled garden where you could be safe enough to grow wild. My mentor, Mr. Chin, who had become a father figure to me, once asked during one of our weekly check-ins, "Sarah, have you ever considered letting people know who you really are?" I shook my head. They do know who I am. They know Sarah Stone. "I mean your past, Serafina," he said gently, one of the few people in the world who knew my real name. "I'm not hiding from it anymore, Samuel," I replied. "But I'm not inviting it back in. I'm not ready to be defined by people who once decided I wasn't worth seeing at all." The truth was, I feared more than just being found. I feared being misinterpreted, my story twisted into a sensationalist narrative that would overshadow the work that had become my life's purpose. I feared becoming the headline instead of the quiet, steady voice of advocacy. But a life built on purpose has its own momentum. A few months later, I stood at a podium at a fundraiser for the collective. The crowd was small but dedicated. With my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm, I announced the launch of my own foundation, funded by a generous grant I had secured and the advance from my first book, a collection of essays on community and belonging titled The Sheltering Grove. The Aegis Foundation, I called it, after an old word meaning noble protector. The foundation's mission is simple, I told the small crowd, my voice clear and certain. To build bridges, not walls. To empower the voices that are so often silenced, and to create spaces where everyone, regardless of where they come from, can feel seen, heard, and valued. I didn't talk about my own family. I didn't mention the cold porch or the $500. My campaign to build the foundation was clean, focused on policy and impact. Its materials featured no glossy headshots of its founder, only the logo, a simple, branching tree with deep roots. And with that, I stepped into a new kind of light, not the harsh glare of public scrutiny, but the warm, steady glow of a purpose I had built with my own two hands. I was fighting not just for the displaced and the forgotten, but for my own right to define myself, to build a legacy without permission, and to be seen only when and how I chose. The news arrived not as a whisper, but as a bold, unavoidable headline in the Boston Globe online edition, "Sterling Heiress under federal investigation for corporate fraud." The name below it was Victoria Sterling. I hadn't said her name out loud in over a decade, but seeing it in print sent a strange, distant jolt through me, like the tremor from a faraway earthquake. The story unfolded over the weekend. A whistleblower from her firm had come forward with evidence that Victoria had orchestrated a hostile takeover of a smaller, family-owned manufacturing company in western Massachusetts, using fraudulent documents and insider information. The takeover had bankrupted the company and destroyed the lives of its owners and employees. Activist groups were calling it a textbook case of corporate predation. Victoria's lawyers were calling it a baseless attack from a disgruntled former employee. The stakes were immense: federal indictment, disbarment, and the complete collapse of the reputation she and my father had so carefully constructed. My small team at the foundation reacted with protective urgency. "We strongly advise you to make no comment," said my communications director, a sharp, loyal woman named Maya. You're a respected public intellectual now. This could drag you into a media circus. It's not your battle, Serafina, my assistant added gently. Let them handle it. But it felt like my battle in a way. Not because I felt any urge to defend Victoria. That well had run dry long ago, but because the story was filled with too many ghosts. The ghost of the girl I used to be, the ghost of the family I once had, and the ghost of the name I still secretly carried. I booked a flight to Boston without a press release or a security detail. I told no one where I was going. When I arrived at the Moakley Courthouse, a modern glass and steel building overlooking the harbor, I was wearing a simple charcoal gray coat, dark trousers, and sunglasses. I slipped in through a side entrance and found a seat in the very last row of the gallery, a space for anonymous observers and forgotten relatives. The courtroom was cavernous and cold, the air sterile. Lawyers in expensive suits whispered to each other, their leather briefcases sighing open and shut. At the defendant's table sat Victoria. She was as impeccable as ever, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon, her posture ramrod straight. She looked like a queen surveying a battle she was confident she would win, but I saw the betraying tension in the way her fingers gripped her pen. Then, the Honorable Judge Morrison entered. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a reputation for being both fiercely intellectual and deeply fair. She took her seat and began scanning the room, her gaze sweeping over the lawyers, the press, the gallery. Her eyes landed on me. They paused. A flicker of recognition, a slight furrow of her brow. She leaned forward slightly. "Forgive me," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the courtroom. "My apologies for the interruption, but is that Serafina Sterling, the author of The Sheltering Grove?" A profound silence fell. Every head in the room turned, a slow, collective wave of curiosity. Reporters in the front row began whispering frantically to each other. A court sketch artist, who had been lazily drawing the prosecutors, suddenly began sketching me with renewed vigor. Victoria's head whipped around, her carefully constructed composure dissolving in an instant. Her eyes locked with mine, and in them I saw not the disdain of 15 years ago, but a raw, unvarnished shock. My mother, Eleanor, seated beside her, turned so pale she seemed to blend into the white marble wall behind her. Her hand flew to her throat, a gesture of pure, instinctual panic. My father, sitting ramrod straight next to my mother, squinted, as if trying to reconcile the ghost of the daughter he had exiled with the woman now being publicly recognized by a federal judge. I didn't move. I didn't smile or nod. I simply held their gazes, my presence in that room a statement more powerful than any words I could have uttered. The judge cleared her throat, visibly composing herself, and the day's proceedings began. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted irrevocably. Every few minutes, a lawyer or a reporter would steal a glance at the back row. The quiet author, the public ethicist, the forgotten daughter, was in the room. And she was there only to watch. I stayed until the court adjourned for the day. Then I rose and walked out the same side door I had entered, melting back into the anonymity of the city. I didn't need to interfere. I didn't need to offer comfort or condemnation. I had come to witness, and in doing so, I had held up a mirror, forcing them to see not only me, but the reflection of their own choices. By the time I returned to my quiet hotel room, my phone was vibrating with a relentless stream of calls and texts from news outlets I hadn't spoken to in years. My name was trending on Twitter. But this time, the story wasn't about shame or scandal. It was about presence. I sat by the window, watching the lights of Boston twinkle across the harbor, the same harbor I had sketched as a girl. In the reflection in the dark glass, I no longer saw a fractured, haunted face. I saw a woman, whole and composed, her image layered over the city that had cast her out. Serafina Sterling had come home, not as a prodigal daughter, but as a quiet, unmovable fact. It took less than a day for my presence in that courtroom to become the central narrative. The media, hungry for a new angle, seized upon the story with a fervor that was both unnerving and predictable. The Other Sterling, A Tale of Two Sisters, one headline read, "From family outcast to moral compass, the unlikely rise of Serafina Sterling," proclaimed another. My book, The Sheltering Grove, shot to the top of the bestseller lists. And then, the past I had so carefully outrun finally caught up. Someone, likely a reporter digging for dirt or perhaps an old acquaintance from my college days, unearthed the video. The grainy, pixelated clip from a decade and a half ago reappeared, spreading through the dark corners of the internet like a virus. My image at 22, vulnerable and betrayed, was suddenly everywhere again. The headlines turned vicious. A tabloid interviewed Leo, my ex-boyfriend, who played the part of the regretful but ultimately blameless youth. "We were just kids," he said, with a sheepish, camera-ready smile. "I never thought it would get this big." I watched the interview on my laptop in my hotel room, my face calm, my hands steady. I felt a distant, hollow ache, but not the soul-crushing shame of my youth. I had already survived this. I had already walked through this fire. My team at the foundation went into crisis mode. "We need to issue a statement," Maya urged, her voice tight with concern. "We can pursue legal action for invasion of privacy." I said no. "Let them look," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "The woman in that video is not who I am now. I won't be shamed by her ghost." The first call from my family came from my father. His voice was just as I remembered it, cold, authoritative, and laced with accusation. "You are using this family's tragedy for your own personal gain," he said, without any preamble. "Parading your so-called success in front of the media while your sister's life is falling apart." I leaned my head back against the cool glass of the window. "I didn't invite the media, Father," I said, my voice even. "I simply showed up. And as for my success, I built it myself, with no help from the family who threw me away. The name Sterling is a part of my history, but you no longer get to define what it means." I hung up before he could respond. The next day, I got a call from a cousin in Massachusetts. My mother had been taken to the hospital, her blood pressure dangerously high from the stress. Against my better judgment, against every self-protective instinct I had, I went. I walked into her private hospital room unannounced. She looked impossibly small and frail against the stark white sheets, the formidable society matron replaced by a tired, frightened woman. Her eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a raw, unguarded sorrow. "Serafina," she whispered, her voice as brittle as a dried leaf. I didn't speak. I simply pulled a chair to her bedside. "If what the papers say is true, about your life, your work," she began, her voice faltering. Then, "I have spent 15 years not seeing my own daughter." Tears welled in her eyes, the first I had ever seen her shed. I didn't cry. I didn't say, "I forgive you." It would have felt like a neat, tidy bow on a wound that was still healing. Instead, I reached out and took her hand. It felt small and cool in mine. We sat in silence for a long time, not as a mother and a daughter seeking absolution, but as two women acknowledging a shared, painful history. Healing, I was learning, didn't always require words. Sometimes, it just required presence. Before I left, as she drifted into a medicated sleep, I placed a small, smooth, gray stone on her bedside table. I had carried it in my pocket from a riverbank in Portland. It was a small piece of my new world, a symbol of quiet strength and endurance. I walked out of the hospital without leaving a note. Back in Portland, the media storm hadn't subsided. But I refused to hide. At my next scheduled public appearance, a lecture at Reed College, I walked onto the stage with my head held high. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. "The past is a powerful thing," I began, my voice clear and steady. "It can be a weapon used against us, or a foundation upon which we build. I will not allow my past to be used as a weapon. I will, however, decide how it is to be remembered. And I choose to remember it as the beginning of my story, not the end." I then delivered my lecture on ethical leadership, never once mentioning my family by name. I had set my boundary. I had spoken my truth. And the silence that followed, the one that was filled with respect and understanding, was louder and more powerful than any headline. Victoria's indictment came down like a guillotine, swift and final. The golden child of the Sterling family, the legal powerhouse, was now facing a federal trial. The law firms that had once courted her now distanced themselves. The society friends who had once flocked to her now spoke of her in hushed, pitying tones. Her name, once a symbol of prestige, was now synonymous with disgrace. I watched it unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my Portland home, a distant, detached observer. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. "Serafina," she began, her voice trembling. "Your father and I were having a small dinner on Friday. For family, please. Just this once. Come home." The request was so laden with unspoken need it was almost a physical weight. Later that evening, a text from my father. "We need to talk." 15 years of absolute silence, and now, when they were drowning, they remembered I knew how to swim. A part of me, the part that still ached for the family I never had, wanted to say no. But another, stronger part, the part that had learned to face things head-on, knew I had to go. The old house on Ocean Drive felt smaller, the grand foyer less imposing. The air was heavy with the scent of lemon polish and desperation. They were all there. My mother, her smile brittle and her eyes puffy from crying. My father, stiff and uncomfortable in a freshly pressed shirt. And Victoria, a ghost of her former self, sitting at the far end of the dining table, her gaze fixed on her folded hands. The seat they had set for me was my old one, but it had been reupholstered in a stiff, unfamiliar brocade. A superficial fix for a deeply broken thing. My mother served an elaborate meal that no one ate. The silence was agonizing, punctuated only by my mother's forced, bright chatter. "I read a review of your book, dear. So thoughtful," she said. "Your foundation does important work," my father added, his voice strained. "Very impressive." Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I made a mistake, Serafina. A terrible mistake." And then came the real reason for the invitation. "We were thinking," my mother began, her hand hovering near mine before retreating, "that perhaps you could write a letter to the judge." A character reference for Victoria. Speak to her integrity. Coming from you, it would carry so much weight. For family, I looked at their faces. My mother, her hope a desperate, grasping thing. My father, his pride sacrificed at the altar of necessity. My sister, the architect of my exile, now a supplicant. I placed my fork down on the china plate. The small click was the loudest sound in the room. "I have a question," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "If I weren't the founder of the Aegis Foundation, if my book hadn't been successful, if I were still the girl who served coffee in a diner in Portland, would I still be your family? Would you have called?" The silence that answered was my answer. It was absolute and damning. I stood up, pushing my chair back. The weight I had carried for 15 years, the weight of their disapproval and their expectations, lifted from my shoulders. "I kept the name Sterling," I said softly, looking at each of them in turn. "But I built my life without you. And I will continue to do so." I walked to the door, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. "Serafina, please," my mother cried, her voice breaking. But I didn't look back. I stepped out into the cool, salty air of the Beacon's harbor night. For the first time, I wasn't running from that house. I was simply leaving it behind. And I was free. The attacks began at 3:12 a.m. a few nights later. A flood of anonymous emails, sent to reporters, bloggers, and board members of my foundation. They contained everything: screenshots of the old video, excerpts from my private college journals, a photograph of me from my early days in Portland, weeping on a park bench. It was a coordinated, vicious attempt to dismantle my credibility, to paint me as unstable and untrustworthy. By 9 a.m., Maya was in my office, her face grim. "A new smear campaign is launching," she said, showing me a blog post titled, "The Unstable Truth of Serafina Sterling." I felt no fear, only a cold, clear certainty. At noon, I received a call from an old acquaintance who now worked at the Department of Justice. "Off the record, Serafina," he said, "but we're hearing that your father has been making inquiries, using his contacts to dig for leverage against you." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat, delivered through the velvet glove of family ties. They were trying to silence me, to force me to help them by threatening to burn my new world to the ground. That evening, I didn't hide. I didn't draft a defensive statement. I walked straight into the fire. The next morning, I held a press conference. I stood at a simple podium in front of a backdrop of photos from the communities the Aegis Foundation served. I wore a simple cream-colored dress. I was unarmed, but I was not unprotected. "Power is a complex thing," I began, my voice calm and resonant. "It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It comes in the form of a family dinner invitation that is actually a summons. It comes in the form of anonymous threats designed to leverage love and loyalty against integrity." I paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, I am here to announce that my foundation is partnering with legal scholars to draft model legislation. We're calling it the Integrity Shield Act. It is designed to create new, robust protections for witnesses, whistleblowers, and public figures against coercion and intimidation, especially when that pressure comes from within their own families." I didn't name them, but I didn't have to. The message was unmistakable. The media narrative shifted in an instant. The story was no longer about my past, but about my courage. "Serafina Sterling Fights Back," one headline read. "A new kind of armor, how one woman is redefining power." My family fell silent. No more calls. No more texts. No more threats. They had played their last card, and I had refused to fold. Weeks later, I was walking through the Portland Farmers Market, enjoying the quiet anonymity of a Saturday morning. No one pointed. No one stared. I was just another woman in a rain jacket, buying kale and artisan bread. And I smiled. I didn't need to be seen anymore. I was finally, fully, seeing myself. It was just past noon on a Tuesday when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Serafina, your sister is here." "In the lobby." "Victoria?" I asked, surprised. "Does she have an appointment?" "No. She says she's willing to wait. She just wants to see you." Alone. A long moment passed. I nodded. "Send her in." I cleared my desk of everything but a glass of water. When Victoria walked in, she was a specter of her former self. No power suit, no makeup. Just a plain sweater and jeans, and a weariness that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. She sat in the chair opposite me, the wide expanse of my desk a chasm between us. "I don't know where to begin," she said, her voice soft, stripped of its usual sharp edges. "Except to say that I know I destroyed any chance we had of being sisters. I was jealous of you, Serafina. You had a freedom I never allowed myself to imagine. You were authentic, and I was a performance. I built my life on a foundation of ambition, and I stepped on you to build it higher." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not here to ask you to save me from prison. I'm here because I needed to tell you the truth, at least once." I watched her, my own emotions a quiet, calm sea. "You didn't destroy me, Victoria," I said, my voice gentle. "You only forced me to discover my own strength. You forgot I existed, and in that forgetting, I learned how to become someone unforgettable to myself." Tears streamed down her face. "Mom and Dad still think you'll do something. They can't understand why you won't." I gazed out the window at the city I now called home. "I spent my life saving myself," I said. "My work now is to help others do the same. I'm not in the business of saving people who refuse to save themselves." She nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not hating me." I didn't reply. There was no hug, no dramatic reconciliation. There was only a quiet, honest silence, an acknowledgement of the vast, damaged landscape between us. As Victoria stood to leave, she paused, her hand brushing against a small, framed photo on the corner of my desk. It was a picture of a smiling group of teenage girls, refugees from Afghanistan, who had just won a scholarship through one of my foundation's programs. The door clicked shut behind her. I sat for a long time, the silence of the room a comforting blanket. Then, I turned back to my work, a draft of a new speech on my screen. Some legacies, I thought, can't be erased. But you can choose to be the place where they end. The conference was a gathering of storytellers, but not the kind who wrote fiction. It was a national summit on ethical leadership and restorative justice. The room was filled with people who had spoken truth to power, often at great personal cost. I was the keynote speaker. I stood backstage, listening as a video played, a montage of people whose lives had been upended for telling the truth. The moderator introduced me simply, Serafina Sterling, author, advocate, and a testament to the power of a quiet voice. I stepped into the warm spotlight, the faces in the audience a blur of anticipation. I was once told I was a disgrace, I began. Then I was erased. Then I was threatened, not with violence, but with the ghosts of my own past. A quiet intensity settled over the room. People leaned in. I am not here today to ask for an apology, I continued. I am here to imagine a world where our children do not have to choose between their integrity and their family. A world where belonging is not contingent on silence. I scanned the crowd, and my eyes found them. In the third row, my mother, looking older, smaller, but with a new softness in her eyes. Tears were streaming silently down her face. A few rows behind her, my father, no longer the imposing judge, but just a man, his arms crossed over his chest as if to hold in a lifetime of rigid certainty that had finally begun to crack. Victoria was not there, but in a way, her absence was its own presence. That is the world I am working to build, I concluded. A world where every one of us has the right to own our story and to decide, for ourselves, when and how it ends. The applause was not thunderous. It was deep, sustained, and filled with a profound, emotional understanding. As I walked off the stage, there were no bouquets of flowers, no crowd of reporters. There was only the quiet, grounded feeling of having planted a seed in a vast, waiting field. I hadn't erased the name Sterling. I had simply given it a new meaning. 6 months later, I was back in Portland, at a small community center, for a panel on youth leadership. I arrived early, wearing jeans and a soft cashmere sweater, and helped set up chairs. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't stand at the podium. I sat on the edge of the stage, my legs dangling. People often ask me how I succeeded without a safety net, I said to the small crowd of teenagers. The truth is, I didn't succeed without one. I just learned how to weave my own, out of kindness, purpose, and the strength of the community I found. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. What if, she asked, her voice hesitant, what if the people who hurt you actually change? What if they come back and say they're sorry? I smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Then you listen. You listen with an open heart. But you remember that forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. You can forgive someone from a distance. You don't have to let them back into the garden you've worked so hard to cultivate. The audience was quiet, the air filled with the gentle hum of understanding. It was then that I saw him, standing at the back of the room by the door. My father. He was just watching me, his expression unreadable. I held his gaze for a moment, not with defiance or hurt, but with a calm, clear peace. When the event was over, as people began to disperse, he walked slowly toward me. He didn't wait for a private moment. He simply stood in front of me, in the middle of the emptying room. I never understood you, Serafina, he said, his voice raspy with an emotion I couldn't name. But I think I'm beginning to understand that I don't have to. I just have to see you. He paused, his gaze sweeping over me, the woman I had become. And I do. I see you now. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was just an acknowledgement. It was enough. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to hug him. I simply inclined my head, a gesture of peace, not of surrender. Outside, a soft Portland drizzle had begun to fall, washing the world clean. I stepped out into the cool, misty air. I didn't look back to see if he was watching. I just kept walking, alone but not lonely, through the quiet hush of the city that had saved me. I had spent so long fighting just to be seen. Now, finally, I had learned the profound, quiet grace of seeing myself. Healing, I've learned, isn't about rewriting the past. It's about having the courage to refuse to let it define your future. We don't choose the family we are born into, but we do get to choose the family we create, the values we uphold, and the ground on which we stand. And sometimes, standing on your own is the first step to building something truly unbreakable.